The air in the Grand Parisian salon was thick enough to taste. It was a rich, heavy cocktail of expensive perfume, the sweet smell of wax from the dozens of candles flickering in crystal chandeliers, and the faint, bitter scent of cigar smoke that curled towards the ceiling like lazy ghosts. The year was 1841, and in this city, a person's worth was often measured by the company they kept and the parties they attended. Tonight, the party was at the home of a wealthy banker, and the room was glittering with the city's finest. Women in dresses of silk and satin rustled like leaves in a windstorm as they moved, their jewels catching the light. Men with perfectly waxed mustaches and crisp cravats stood in small groups, their voices a low hum of conversation and laughter. But all of this, all the beauty and the chatter, was just background noise. The real reason everyone was there was sitting at the grand piano in the center of the room. His name was Alessandro, a musician from Milan who had taken Paris by storm. He wasn't just a pianist. He was a performer in every sense of the word. He had dark, slicked-back hair that shone under the lamplight, and he wore a coat of deep velvet that seemed to absorb all the light around him. As he played, his whole body moved with the music. He leaned back dramatically during soft passages. His eyes closed as if in a state of divine bliss, and then he would lunge forward, his fingers flying across the keys with a ferocious energy that made the piano itself seem to groan under the pressure. He had just finished the final note of a loud, complicated piece of his own creation. It was a fantasy based on a popular Italian opera, full of big, crashing chords and dizzyingly fast runs that showed off his incredible skill. The last sound echoed in the silent room for a moment, and then the place exploded. People clapped and cheered, some even rising to their feet. "Bravo, bravo, signor!" a man near the front shouted. Alessandro rose from the piano bench and gave a slow, deliberate bow, a small, satisfied smile playing on his lips. He ate this up. He lived for this moment, for the adoration of the crowd. As the applause began to die down and people settled back into their seats, a woman in a large feathered hat fanned herself and called out, "Signor Alessandro, you are a master!" A true lion of the keyboard. This was the opening he had been waiting for. He let the compliment hang in the air for a moment, soaking it in, before he responded. "Thank you, madame," he said, his voice smooth and rich like dark honey. "But one must have passion to play, no? True fire, the heart of an Italian, perhaps." He winked, and a few people in the crowd chuckled. He had them in the palm of his hand. Then he decided to stir the pot a little. It was a game he liked to play, to show his superiority not just through his music, but through his opinions. "It is this fire," he continued, his voice growing a little louder, "that I find so lacking in some of the music we hear today in Paris." He let his gaze drift around the room, as if he were searching for someone who might disagree. "There is one composer in particular," he said, his tone becoming almost conspiratorial. "A Polish gentleman. You know of whom I speak?" A few people nodded knowingly. The name was on everyone's lips, even if the man himself was rarely seen in such public gatherings. Frederick Chopin. Alessandro gave a little wave of his hand, a gesture of dismissal. "Ah, poor Monsieur Chopin," he said, and a few people tittered. "His music, it is, how shall I say? It is pretty, like a delicate porcelain doll. It is music for a small room, for a sickbed. It is all whispers and sighs." He then put on a little show. He hunched his shoulders, held his hands limply over his lap as if hovering over imaginary keys, and played a few silent, trembling notes with his fingers. Plink, plonk, plink. He mimicked, his face a mask of frailty and weakness. There is no strength, no backbone. It is the sound of a moth beating against a window pane, not the roar of a lion. This time the laughter was louder and more widespread. The people in the room, many of whom didn't know much about music beyond what they were told, trusted Alessandro. He was the famous virtuoso, the master. If he said Chopin's music was weak, then it must be true. They saw the confidence in his eyes, the power in his posture, and they compared it to the stories they'd heard of the frail, often ill Polish composer who shunned the spotlight. It was easy to believe him, but not everyone was laughing. Tucked away in a quiet corner of the room, Almost hidden by the heavy velvet curtains stood a young woman. Her name was Zofia. She was the daughter of Polish immigrants. People who had been forced to flee their homeland after a great uprising for freedom was crushed. She didn't wear a silk dress or sparkling jewels. Her dress was simple, made of a dark, plain fabric. And she was only there because the kind lady she gave piano lessons to had brought her along as a guest. She had been watching Alessandro, first with admiration for his technical skill, but then with a growing sense of unease. Now, as he mocked Chopin that unease had turned into a hot, tight knot in her stomach. To Zofia, Chopin's music wasn't weak. It was everything. It was the sound of her homeland. It was the deep, sad beauty of the Polish countryside, the pride of her people, and the sharp, piercing pain of losing that home. When she played his mazurkas, she could see her grandparents dancing at a village festival. When she heard his nocturnes, she felt the quiet loneliness of an exile, staring up at the same moon that shone on a country she might never see again. His music wasn't a whisper. It was a conversation, a story told from the heart. It was the sound of a soul, not a show. She watched as the elegant Parisians laughed at the Italians' cruel imitation. They didn't understand. They couldn't. To them, Poland was just a place on a map, a faraway land they knew nothing about. To her, it was everything. And Chopin was its voice. Her eyes scanned the room and landed on a small group of people near the doorway. And there he was, the man himself, Frederick Chopin. He was even paler than the story suggested, with a thin, delicate face and a look of profound sadness in his eyes. He was leaning on the arm of a friend for support. He had heard everything. Zofia saw the flicker of pain in his eyes, the way his jaw tightened ever so slightly. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, a silent, wounded figure, taking the blows in a room full of people who were supposed to be admirers of art. Alessandro, seeing that he had the full attention of the room, decided to deliver his final grand statement. "Music must have blood in its veins," he declared, his voice booming. "It must have passion. It must be a celebration of life, not a surrender to sorrow." He raised his glass in a toast. "To music with a strong heart." The crowd cheered again, raising their glasses. "To a strong heart?" they echoed. The sound washed over the room, a wave of ignorant agreement. Zofia felt her own heart pounding against her ribs, a frantic, angry rhythm. She looked from the smug, triumphant face of the Italian pianist to the quiet, pained expression of the Polish composer. And in that moment, something inside her shifted. The hot knot in her stomach hardened into a cold, heavy stone of resolve. She knew, with a certainty that scared her, that she could not let this stand. She could not let this man mock the very soul of her country and get away with it. The cheers for the Italian pianist echoed for what felt like a very long time, bouncing off the gilded walls and mixing with the happy clinking of wine glasses. The crowd was completely won over. They saw him not just as a musician, but as a master of life itself, a man who lived with passion and wasn't afraid to speak his mind. To them, his mockery of the Polish composer wasn't cruelty. It was just a bit of fun, a clever joke from a clever man. They turned back to their conversations, their laughter a little low, their spirits lifted by the performance and the champagne, but in the quiet corner, the world had gone silent for Zofia. The anger inside her wasn't a hot flash anymore. It had cooled and hardened into a heavy stone in her chest, cold and heavy. She could barely hear the chatter around her. All she could see was the image of the Italian's hunched shoulders, his silly imitation of a weak, trembling man. And all she could feel was the deep, personal sting of it. It wasn't just an insult to a composer she admired. It was an insult to her father, who hummed old Polish folk songs while he mended their shoes. It was an insult to her mother, who cried quietly on Christmas Eve for the family they left behind. It was an insult to every memory she held dear of a homeland she could only visit in her dreams. She gripped the small, worn reticule in her hands, the strings digging into her palms. Her throat felt tight. What would she even say? These people would laugh at her. They would see her simple dark dress, her clean but scuffed shoes, and they would dismiss her before she even opened her mouth. She was a piano teacher, a nobody in a world of somebodies. The Italian Alessandro was a star. His word was gold. Her word would be dust. A waiter passed by with a tray of glasses, and she took one, just to have something to do. The cool crystal felt slippery in her damp hand. She took a small sip, the fizzy wine doing nothing to calm the storm inside her. She looked around the room. People were smiling, relaxed, enjoying their evening. They had already forgotten the cruel joke. But she couldn't forget. She couldn't unhear it. It was like a splinter in her mind, working its way deeper with every passing second. She thought about the music she loved. She thought about a particular nocturne by Chopin, one she often played late at night when the house was quiet. It wasn't loud or flashy. It was like a conversation with the moon. It started with a simple, sad melody, like a person asking a question into the darkness. Then it would grow a little more complex, as if the answer was complicated and full of more questions. It was the sound of loneliness, but also of hope. It was the sound of a heart that had been broken but was still beating. How could this man not hear that? How could he only hear weakness? Her eyes found the Polish composer again. He was still standing near the doorway, but he looked smaller now, as if he had physically shrunk. He whispered something to the friend who was supporting him, and Zofia could see the weariness on his face. It was the look of a man who had fought a long, hard battle and was too tired to fight anymore. He gave a small, sad nod to his friend and began to turn, to slip away quietly into the night, defeated. That was the moment. Seeing him retreat, seeing the light in his eyes extinguished by the cruelty of a popular man, something inside Zofia finally broke. It wasn't a violent break, but a clean one, like a snapped thread. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was suddenly smaller than the other feeling, the feeling of profound, unshakable wrongness. If she let him walk out of this room like this, if she let this lie stand, then a piece of her own soul would retreat with him. She didn't remember making a decision. She didn't remember taking a step. It was as if her body moved on its own, driven by a force she didn't know she possessed. The wine glass was left on a small table, forgotten. Her feet, which had felt rooted to the floor, suddenly felt light. She moved out from the shadows of the curtain and into the light. The room was still buzzing with conversation. No one noticed her at first? She was just another figure in a crowd. She took a deep breath, the air feeling thick and heavy in her lungs. And then she spoke. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't have the booming power of the Italians. But it was clear, and it was sharp, and it cut through the noise like a shard of glass. "Signor." Just one word. But it was enough. The conversations nearby faltered. A few heads turned in her direction. She saw their curious looks, their eyes scanning her simple dress, their confusion clear. She ignored them. Her eyes were locked on the man at the center of the room, the man who was now accepting a compliment from a lady with a large feathered hat. He didn't hear her at first. She had to say it again, a little louder this time, her voice surprisingly steady. "Signor?" This time he heard. He turned his head, a look of mild annoyance on his face, as if a servant had interrupted him. But when he saw it was just a young woman, a stranger, his expression softened into one of amused curiosity. The conversations around the room had now stopped completely. A ripple of silence spread outwards from where she stood. Until the entire grand salon was quiet, all eyes on her. Alessandro gave her a slow, lazy smile, the kind a predator might give a small, unexpected animal. "Yes, mademoiselle?" he said, his voice dripping with polite condescension. "Are you lost?" The room held its breath. This was better than any performance. This was real-life drama. Zofia felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, but she focused only on his. The stone in her chest had become a pillar of strength. "You are mistaken, signor," she said, her voice clear and firm, her Polish accent giving the simple words a strange, formal beauty. "You mistake strength for noise." A small gasp went through the crowd. Alessandro's smile froze for a fraction of a second, then returned wider this time, but with a colder edge to it. He was intrigued. He gestured with one hand, a grand, theatrical wave that invited her to continue. "Is that so? Please enlighten us." We are all ears. He thought this was a game. He thought she was a fool. But Zofia was not playing a game. She was speaking the truth as she knew it from the bottom of her heart. You hear only whispers and sighs because you are listening with your ears, she continued, her voice growing a little stronger, filled with a passion that surprised even herself. You must listen with your soul. That music you mock is not the sound of a weak man. It is the sound of a nation that has lost its home, but not its spirit. It is the sound of a heart that is broken, but is still brave enough to love. It is not the roar of a lion in a cage, Signor. It is the quiet, powerful beat of a free heart that no cage can ever hold. The silence in the room was absolute. No one moved. No one breathed. Her words, so simple and so full of emotion, hung in the air, shimmering with truth. The people in the room, for the first time that night, were not just watching a show. They were feeling something. They were looking at this plain young woman not with pity or amusement, but with a dawning respect. Alessandro stared at her, his face unreadable. The amusement was gone, replaced by a look of intense, cold calculation. He had been challenged, publicly, and by the most unlikely of opponents. He could not let this stand. His reputation, his very identity as the master, was on the line. He let the silence stretch for a few more moments, then he let out a short, sharp laugh. It was not a happy sound. Ah, he said, his voice now loud and booming again, trying to reclaim control of the room. A poetess as well as a defender of the weak. How wonderful. He looked her up and down, his gaze dismissive. It is easy to talk, mademoiselle. It is easy to use pretty words. But music is not made of words. It is made of sound. He took a step towards her, then another, until he was standing just a few feet away. He loomed over her, a powerful, confident figure. He looked down at her, a challenging glint in his eyes. So, he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous purr that everyone could still hear, you believe you understand this true strength? You believe you can show us what my noise cannot? Then, mademoiselle, he swept a grand gesture towards the empty piano bench, an invitation that was both a challenge and a trap. The stage is yours. The words hung in the air, heavy and sharp. The stage is yours. It wasn't an invitation. It was a sentence. The crowd, which had been a sea of whispers and murmurs, fell into a dead, heavy silence. It was the kind of silence that presses in on you, that makes you aware of every beat of your own heart. Every eye in the room was fixed on Zofia. She could feel their gazes like a physical weight. 100 tiny spotlights burning into her skin. They were waiting for the crash, for the embarrassing moment when this plain, unknown girl would fail and the great man would be proven right. For a single, terrifying second, Zofia wanted to run. Her feet felt like they were nailed to the floor. Her mind screamed at her to sit back down, to disappear into the curtains, to pretend it never happened. What had she been thinking? She was a piano teacher for children, not a concert artist. She played in small rooms for students who struggled to remember their scales. She didn't perform for kings and dukes, for the sharpest, most critical minds in Paris, but then she looked past Alessandro's smug face. She looked to the doorway, where the polished composer was still standing, his friend's hand on his arm, holding him in place. He hadn't left. He was watching her, and in his sad, tired eyes she saw something new. It wasn't pity. It was a tiny, flickering spark of hope. It was the look of a man who, for a long time, had felt alone in the world, and had just seen someone stand up to fight for him. In that spark, Zofia found her strength. The fear didn't go away, but it was pushed aside by a much stronger feeling, a deep, calm sense of purpose. This was not about her anymore. It was about something much, much bigger. She took a step, then another. The walk to the piano was the longest walk of her life. The plush carpet seemed to swallow her feet, slowing her down. The faces in the crowd were a blur of painted lips and wide, curious eyes. She could see the doubt on their faces, the amusement in their smiles. They were expecting a spectacle, a failure. She was not going to give them one. She kept her eyes forward, focused on the beautiful, dark wood of the Erard piano waiting for her like an old friend. When she reached it, she didn't immediately sit. She let her hand rest gently on the polished surface, feeling the cool, smooth wood under her fingers. It was a comforting, familiar feeling. This was her world. This was where she spoke her true language. She could feel the faint vibration of the room, the tension in the air, but the piano itself was solid, steady, and true. She ran her hand along the curve of its side before finally sitting down on the bench. It was a little too low, as it often was for taller men. She reached down and carefully adjusted the knob, raising it to the right height. The small metallic click sound was the only noise in the entire silent room. It was a simple human action, and it seemed to break the spell just a little. She placed her fingers on the keys, but she did not play yet. She took a slow, deep breath, just as she had taught her young students to do when they were nervous. She closed her eyes for a moment, blocking out the crowd, the lights, the expectant faces. She was no longer in a grand Parisian salon. She was back in the small room where she taught, with the afternoon sun streaming through the window. She was thinking of her father, telling her stories of their homeland, of the fields of poppies and the sound of crickets in the summer night. She was thinking of the music that lived inside her, the music that was more than just notes on a page. Alessandro watched her, his arms crossed over his chest. He was still smiling, but it was a tight, impatient smile. He had given her enough time to make a fool of herself. He was ready for her to stumble, to play a few clumsy scales and burst into tears. He had already planned the condescending little speech he would make afterwards about how passion must be paired with skill, but then Zofia began to play. The first notes were not loud. They were soft, almost hesitant, like a question asked in the dark. A single, melancholic melody began to weave its way through the quiet. It was a sound that no one in that room was expecting. It wasn't a showy tune or a familiar folk song. It was a voice, a lonely, searching voice that seemed to be telling a story of great sadness. The sound was so pure, so full of a deep and quiet ache, that it seemed to absorb all the air in the room. People found themselves leaning forward without even realizing it, straining to hear, to understand the tale being told. Alessandro's smile faltered. He had expected noise or silence, but not this. This was something else entirely. As the melody continued, a new sound joined it from her left hand. It wasn't just a simple accompaniment. It was a rhythmic, pulsing beat, like a distant drum or the steady heartbeat of a sleeping giant. The music began to grow, to take on a new life. The lonely melody was no longer just sad. It was filled with a longing, a deep yearning for something that was lost. Zofia's fingers, which had looked so small and delicate, now moved with a quiet confidence over the keys. She wasn't looking at her hands. Her eyes were closed, her head tilted slightly to the side, as if she were listening to the music herself, as if it were coming from somewhere else and she was just the one guiding it. Into the room, the story she was telling began to change. The music became more agitated, more passionate. The heartbeat in her left hand grew faster, more insistent. The melody was no longer just a question. It was a cry. It was the sound of a memory that was both beautiful and painful. It was the dance of a village festival, but seen through the tears of someone who can never go home. The people in the room were no longer thinking about the simple girl or the arrogant Italian. They were lost in the story. They could see the images in their minds, a windswept plain, a lonely horseman, a mother's lullaby sung under a foreign sky. Then the storm began. Without warning, the music exploded. The quiet heartbeat in her left hand became a thundering roar, a torrent of sound that shook the very foundations of the room. The melody was no longer a single voice. It was a choir of defiant, passionate cries. Zofia's body swayed with the music, her whole being pouring into the instrument. Her fingers flew across the keys, no longer just playing notes but striking them with a fierce, controlled power. This was the strength she had spoken of. It wasn't the loud, empty noise of the Italian's performance. This was a storm filled with meaning, a tempest of sorrow, anger, love, and an unbreakable will. It was the sound of a soul fighting against the darkness, A battle that was both terrifying and utterly beautiful. Alessandro stood frozen, his arms hanging limply at his sides. The smug look had been wiped clean from his face, replaced by a look of utter shock and disbelief. He was a master of technique, of making the piano do tricks. But this was not a trick. This was magic. This was truth. He was hearing the music he had mocked, but for the first time he was truly listening. And what he heard was a strength so profound, so much deeper and more powerful than his own, that it shook him to his core. The music reached its peak, a final, desperate, soaring cry that seemed to tear at the very fabric of the air. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The final chords crashed down like a wave, and then there was silence, but it wasn't the same silence as before. This was a different kind of quiet. It was a sacred, holy silence, the kind that comes after a profound experience. It was the silence of 100 people who had just had their hearts opened and their minds changed. No one moved. No one spoke. They just sat there, staring at the young woman with her head bowed over the keys, her hands trembling slightly, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She had given them everything she had, and in doing so she had done more than just play a song. She had spoken the truth. The silence that followed the final crashing chord was not an empty silence. It was a full, heavy silence, packed so tightly with emotion that it felt like a physical presence in the room. It was the kind of silence that makes you hold your own breath, afraid to break the spell. Zofia sat with her head bowed, her hands still resting on the keys, which were now cool beneath her trembling fingers. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, so hard and fast she thought it might burst. She felt empty, as if she had poured out her entire soul through her fingertips and left nothing behind. The rush of adrenaline that had carried her through the performance was fading, leaving behind a deep, bone-shaking weariness. She could feel the weight of 100 stares, but they were different now. They weren't the curious, doubtful looks from before. They were stares of wonder, of disbelief, of dawning understanding. But Zofia wasn't thinking about the crowd. She was lost in the echo of the music, in the images it had painted in her mind. She was back in the homeland she had never really known, walking through fields of rye under a vast, open sky. Then, a single sound broke the sacred quiet. It was not a gasp or a cough. It was the clear, distinct sound of one person clapping. It was a slow, deliberate clap, full of reverence and respect. Every head in the room turned towards the sound. It came from the doorway. It was the Polish composer. He stood there, no longer leaning on his friend for support. He was standing tall, his frail frame seeming to fill the space with an inner strength. Tears were streaming down his pale cheeks, but his face was not sad. It was radiant. He clapped again, a little faster this time, his eyes fixed on Zofia with an expression of pure, unadulterated gratitude. It was the most powerful applause Zofia could ever have imagined. It was not for a performer. It was for a messenger. It was a thank you from the heart of the music itself. That single clap was like a crack in a dam. A woman in the front row, her face streaked with tears, let out a choked sob and jumped to her feet, clapping wildly. Then another person stood, and another. A wave of sound began to build, starting as a few scattered claps and then growing into a thundering, overwhelming roar. The entire room was on its feet. The applause was not polite or formal. It was raw, emotional, and deafening. It was a release of all the tension and emotion that Zofia's music had built up. People were shouting, "Brava, brava!" Some were crying openly, others were just staring, their faces a mask of awe. Through the noise, Zofia saw the Polish composer begin to move towards her. The crowd parted for him as if he were royalty. He walked slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. When he reached the piano, he gently placed a hand on her shoulder. The touch was light, but it felt like a spark of pure warmth. "You did not just play the notes," he said, his voice soft and raspy with emotion, but clear enough for her to hear. "You spoke the language of the heart. You spoke for all of us who are lost. Thank you." Zofia looked up at him, at the tears still glistening on his face, and felt a lump rise in her throat. She couldn't speak. She could only nod, her own vision blurring with tears. This was all that mattered. This was the only validation she had ever needed. The cheers of the crowd were just noise. This quiet, heartfelt words were the truth. Meanwhile, on the other side of the room, Alessandro stood as if he had been turned to stone. The wall of sound from the applause hit him like a physical force, but he didn't move. The faces that had been smiling at him just moments before were now turned away, all their attention focused on the plain young woman at the piano. He was invisible. He was a forgotten statue in a garden where a new, more beautiful flower had suddenly bloomed. The cold knot of shame that had been tightening in his stomach, since the music began, now turned into a crushing weight. He finally understood. He saw it now. The strength she had spoken of wasn't in the volume or the speed. It was in the courage to be vulnerable, to pour your truest feelings into the music and let them be seen. His own performances were a fortress built of technique and showmanship, designed to impress and to keep the world at a distance. Her performance was an open field, completely exposed, inviting everyone in, and he had mocked it. He had called it weak. He watched as the Polish composer, the man he had so cruelly imitated, now stood beside the young woman, a look of fatherly pride and protectiveness on his face. He saw the way the crowd looked at her, not just with admiration, but with a kind of love. He had been so blind. He had spent his life mastering the craft of music. But she, in a single performance, had shown him the art. The difference was vast. And it humbled him completely. The applause began to die down. But the energy in the room was still electric. People started to move, gathering in small groups, their voices a low, excited buzz. But they weren't talking about the Italian virtuoso anymore. They were talking about Zofia. They were asking each other, "Who is she? And did you ever hear such a thing?" The power in the room had shifted so completely it felt like the air itself had changed direction. Zofia, finally finding her strength, slowly rose from the piano bench. Her legs felt shaky, like a newborn colt's. The Polish composer squeezed her shoulder gently, a silent gesture of support. A few people from the crowd started to approach her, their faces full of kind curiosity, but the composer held up a hand, giving her space. He understood she was not a public figure, not someone who basked in the glow of attention. She was a vessel, and the journey had left her drained. Alessandro watched this all unfold from his corner. He knew he had to do something. He couldn't just slip away like a thief in the night. That would be the act of a coward, and while he now knew he was arrogant, he was not a coward. He had to face this. He had to face her, taking a deep breath that felt like swallowing glass. He began to walk towards the piano. The crowd seemed to sense his movement and parted for him, creating a clear path. The low chatter died down as everyone watched to see what would happen. He felt their eyes on him, but this time there was no admiration in their gaze, only a cold, expectant judgment. He stopped a few feet away from Zofia. She looked up at him, her expression wary but not defiant. She was simply too exhausted for defiance. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not a rival who had defeated him, but a teacher who had given him a painful but necessary lesson. He saw the honesty in her eyes, the same honesty that had been in her music. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He had to force them out. "I was wrong," he said, his voice barely a whisper, but in the quiet room it carried to every ear. "What I said, it was the sound of a fool. You were right. There's a strength I never understood." He gave a slow, stiff bow, not a theatrical one, but a genuine, heartfelt gesture of respect. "You have my deepest apologies." A wave of murmurs went through the crowd. They had not expected this. Zofia simply looked at him, her expression softening. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was enough. It was an acceptance of his apology, and a closing of the conflict. Alessandro straightened up, his face pale, but his eyes clear. Without another word, he turned and walked away, not with his head held high in false pride, but with his shoulders slightly slumped, a man who had been thoroughly and profoundly humbled. He moved through the crowd, which now watched him in silence. and disappeared through the doorway, leaving the grand salon forever changed. And in the center of it all stood Zofia, the quiet piano teacher who had done more than just stun a room full of people. She had reminded them that true art doesn't shout to be heard. It speaks directly to the heart, and in doing so, it can change the world. The Grand Salon was a different world now. The air, once thick with perfume and arrogance, was alive with a new kind of energy, a hum of profound emotion and whispered awe. People were no longer just guests at a party. They were witnesses to a miracle. They moved in small groups, their faces still reflecting the shock and beauty of what they had just experienced. But in the center of this storm of attention, Zofia felt a strange sense of calm, a quiet eye in the hurricane. The adrenaline that had fueled her was gone, and in its place was a deep, resonant weariness that settled into her very bones. The Polish composer's hand was still a gentle weight on her shoulder. It was an anchor in the sea of faces. He seemed to understand that she had nothing left to give, that the performance had taken everything from her. He spoke softly to her, his words meant only for her. "You must rest," he said, his voice full of a quiet authority. "This is not a time for more noise. It is a time for peace." He nodded to his friend, who gently cleared a path through the crowd. People stepped back, their expressions a mixture of respect and curiosity, creating a corridor for them. They didn't try to stop her or talk to her. They simply watched her pass as if she were a sacred relic being carried from a battlefield dot as they walked towards the door. Zofia caught snippets of conversations. Never heard anything like it. The strength in those quiet moments. She made him look like a child banging on pots. She didn't feel pride in these words, only a distant sense of wonder. It was as if they were talking about someone else. The woman who had played was a version of herself she had never met before, a person possessed by a force greater than herself. The cool night air was a shock when they stepped outside. The city was alive with the clip-clop of horses' hooves on cobblestones and the distant laughter from other houses. The sounds of normal life felt strange and loud after the profound silence of the salon. The composer's friend hailed a cab, a simple, dark carriage that waited by the curb. Before she got in, the composer reached into his coat and pulled out a small, flat package wrapped in plain paper. He pressed it into her hands. "For you," he said simply. "Not as a payment, but as a thank you. From one who understands to another who now understands." He didn't explain what it was, and Zofia didn't ask. She simply held it, the paper cool against her skin. She looked into his eyes, wanting to say something, to express the gratitude she felt for his music, for his presence, for his kindness. But the words wouldn't come. He seemed to understand. He gave her a small, sad smile and a slight bow. The carriage door closed, and she was alone in the dark, moving through the city streets, clutching the mysterious package like a lifeline. Her small apartment was exactly as she had left it. A single candle burned on the table, casting a warm, flickering light on the familiar, worn furniture. For a moment, the events of the evening felt like a dream, a fantasy that had happened to someone else. But then she saw her hands. They were still trembling slightly. She sat at her own small, upright piano, which looked so plain and humble compared to the grandeur art in the salon. She ran her fingers over the yellowed ivory keys that had taught 100 children their first scales. She finally unwrapped the package. Inside was a book of sheet music. The cover was plain, but the title was handwritten in elegant, familiar script. It was a collection of his nocturnes, and on the title page he had written a few words. "To the one who gave my music a voice it never had before?" Tears welled in Zofia's eyes, but this time they were not tears of sorrow or exhaustion. They were tears of quiet, overwhelming joy. She didn't try to play any of the pieces. She just sat there, holding the book, feeling the weight of the gift and the meaning behind it. She had not sought fame or fortune. She had only spoken the truth as she knew it, and in return, she had received the ultimate validation from the source of that truth. The next morning, the world felt different. The sun streamed through her window, and the dust motes dancing in the light seemed to dance to a new, more hopeful rhythm. The story of the salon had already spread through the city like wildfire. The tale of the unknown Polish girl who had silenced the famous Italian with the power of a single song was on everyone's lips. Zofia heard the whispers when she went to the market. People looked at her with a new kind of respect, but she did not seek out the attention. She returned to her life, to her small apartment and her simple teaching, but her teaching had changed. When a young student struggled with a passage, she no longer just corrected their fingering. She would ask them, "What story is this note trying to tell? What feeling is hiding in the silence?" She was no longer just teaching music. She was teaching the language of the heart. Her students began to improve not just in their technique, but in their ability to connect with the music, to find their own stories within the notes. She found a deep, quiet fulfillment in this, a sense of purpose that was far more rewarding than the applause of 1,000 strangers miles away. In another part of Paris, Alessandro also found his world changed. The days following the salon were the hardest of his life. He stayed in his lavish apartment, refusing to see anyone. He tried to play, but his own compositions felt hollow, like empty shells. The thundering chords and dazzling runs that had once brought him so much adoration now sounded to him like the noise he had accused Chopin's music of being. They were all show, no soul. One evening, in a fit of frustration, he swept all his own music from the piano. It scattered on the floor like fallen leaves. He walked to his bookshelf and pulled out a dusty volume of Chopin's ballades, the very piece Zofia had played. He placed it on the stand and stared at the notes. They looked the same as they always had, but he knew they were different. He tried to play. His fingers, so accustomed to flying across the keys, felt clumsy and awkward. He couldn't find the emotion, the story. He became angry, slamming his fists on the keys, producing a discordant crash, but he didn't give up. Day after day, he returned to the music. He stopped trying to conquer it and started trying to listen to it. He played the opening notes of the first ballade over and over, not with power, but with a gentle questioning, trying to understand the loneliness in the sound. Slowly, painfully, he began to learn. He was a student again, and his teacher was the memory of a young woman's performance. He never played with the same public flair again. When he returned to the stage months later, his playing was quieter, more introspective. He lost some of his old audience who found his new style too serious, but he gained a new kind of respect from fellow musicians who heard the profound change in his art. Years passed. The legend of the night in the salon became a favorite story in Paris, a tale told to young musicians about the true nature of strength and art. Zofia never became a famous concert pianist. She never sought that life. She remained a teacher, a quiet guide in a small room, touching the lives of her students one by one. She was content. She had her music, her memories, and the quiet knowledge that on one unforgettable night, she had made the world listen, not to her but to the truth. And in a world full of noise, that was a victory more beautiful and lasting than any applause.